Ladies, ladies and gentlemen, let's Game Telecom video. We're going to be talking about the Neo. That's right. We all know that September the 7th is going to be rather exciting if you're a PlayStation fan, with Sony being expected to announce formally the PS4K or the Neo, which is naturally the upgraded iteration of the PlayStation 4 hardware. We'll go more into that in just a moment if you're not too familiar with it. However, some updated information has popped out concerning the development kits, which may lend some weight behind the fact that the console is going to be launched this year. So a website by the name of VGLeaks.com have made a post that they have sources which have told them that the final development kits for the Neo will be available to purchase in early September, whereas the Neo PS4 test kits will be available to acquire in October. So just to clarify, once again, the development kits will be available in September, while the test kits are going to be available in October. Now these dates very much lend a lot of weight behind the Neo being launched this year. Sony have told developers, and this is through leaked information, we've all seen the slides several times over if you're a regular viewer, that once the prototype hardware has been made outdated because of the release of the final equipment, they expect the developers to return the prototype hardware to them for whatever reasoning, and essentially you're then left with the final iteration of the hardware, which of course is going to very closely mirror that of the retail specifications of the machine. So for example, if Sony have decided, hey, we're going to increase the CPU speed by an additional 50 megahertz, and I'm just throwing that out there as an example, for the final iteration of the retail hardware, well, in which case you're going to get that, so the specifications are going to match perfectly. So there are going to be two things which developers need to concern themselves with. The first is the Neo PS4 development kit with the somewhat unwieldy name of DUH D7000AA, and as I mentioned, that's going to be available to purchase in September at the rather princely sum of $2,000. And the next one is the PS4 testing kit, the Neo version, which is DUH T7000AA, and that is going to be available to purchase for $800 in October. Unfortunately, we don't know with these rumours what changes, if any, Sony have made to the Neo platform. Now bear in mind, and once again I'm kind of going a little bit over old ground, but I need to somewhat, because obviously I don't know who has watched what video, so it's possible that if you're a new viewer you haven't watched this, or even if you're a regular viewer you might have missed the video. Sony have received a little pressure internally by their own first-party developers that they want upgraded hardware for the Neo. Now we don't know all of the specifics for this, unfortunately, but one of the more keenly requested features is additional memory. Now, once again, we all know that there's an additional 512 megabytes made available for game applications, and I need to specify game applications because it could be, Netflix you're running on your PS4, but game applications will be given an additional reserve of 512 megabytes if they're running on a Neo, and if the game has a Neo mode. So just to clarify, if you're running, let's say, Killzone Shadowfall on your Neo, it will use the same amount of memory as a regular PS4. However, if you are running, let's say, Uncharted 5, which has not been announced before you start Googling it, I always have to clarify that stuff. So let's say that Uncharted 5 came out and it has a release for the Neo as well, obviously. You will put the same disc in, so if you put your friend's if you put the game into your friend's system, it will have less memory to work with than if it was put into your system, which was a PS4K/Neo. Now you don't have to do anything, the game simply tells the system, hey, what are you? Are you a Neo? And of course the system will say, yep, I'm a Neo, bro, and it will just allow the game to have access to that, and of course then the game will load additional assets, it will load high quality, textures and whatever else it's doing into the system. So one report is that we're going to potentially see more memory. Now, I have been asked by a couple of folks, and I could certainly do a bigger video on this, and I possibly will over the next few days. I'm really just kind of running on a treadmill at the moment because Amy's obviously away, so I'm trying to handle that plus the editing of a couple of reviews. I'm finishing the GTX 1070 thing. As regular viewers know, I had a hard drive failure which fucked things over quite nicely for about a week and a half, and on top of that I also decided to delete all of the video editing I'd already done and redo it all because I wanted to make things look a little nicer, which meant I redid all of the graphs and everything else, just because I wanted to change the format a little bit. So hopefully that works out quite nicely. I guess this is review aesthetic 1, no, well, I guess it's 2.5, so hopefully we can improve the quality a little more to make it look even better. But anyway, I'm getting way off topic. So the question I've been asked by several folks is, well, can Sony upgrade the system enough to beat or match the Scorpio, which of course is Microsoft's effort? Short answer, possibly. Long answer, it's possible, but it's unlikely. Basically, it's all down to timing. And one of the key questions I was asked is, would Sony even have time to do it? Well, realistically, it depends what they're doing. So, and I'm vastly simplifying for this video, and if I did end up making a more complex video, then I'd go into this. But basically, when a console manufacturer or any manufacturer is producing a piece of hardware, and that could be a GPU, that could be a CPU, that could be a motherboard, that could be, hell, that could be a bloody lamp. Typically there will be iterations of that hardware. So for example, when you're putting together the complex nature of a console PCB, which obviously is the circuit board which everything else is soldered onto, typically there are going to be changes through that process. So for example, it will be first of all designed in a computer program, and then that circuit board will be printed, but invariably there are going to be fuck-ups. So it could be, for example, that there was supposed to be a resistor, but they actually put in a capacitor on that board. And obviously, it's not until they start going through it by hand and figuring out, okay, well, why the fuck is this exploding? And then they realise, oh, and then you're going to find one that's actually got a bit of hand soldering where they've literally had to just make a bit of a botch job, essentially, to fix it. And there's been several famous incidents of this. If you're familiar with 3D Effects and its demise for the last couple of months of its life, you might recall that their engineers were working with their final hardware, and basically the GPU, well, back then it was a video card, it was basically all working to a degree. There were some problems with it, but the biggest one was that the video connector was the wrong way round, and you actually had to create a connector to quite literally reverse the polarity of the output from the to the screen, because they basically buggered it up early on. And this is very much the norm. Now I know you're thinking, well, what the hell does this have to do with anything? Basically what I'm saying is that Sony could change most things quite late, with the exception of certain aspects. So for example, upclocks to the GPU, upclocks to the CPU, they can do it. It's really down to the heat produced and what they're comfortable with sucking from your wall socket. So for example, and I'm just using figures pulled out of my ass here, but the PS4 supposedly uses about 125 to 140 watts of energy when it's playing games. It's less than that if it's streaming video. That's something I've not personally tested, but that's what I've been hearing. So let's assume a figure of 140. Let's say the worst case scenario. Well, let's assume they're going for a 14nm FinFET process because they're using Polaris. Let's also assume that they're basically shrinking everything down and they're trying to be as power efficient as possible. What they might not want is to go over that power draw, especially if they're keeping a similar form factor for the case, because obviously they can't fit in necessarily chunkier cooling mechanisms to keep the thing from exploding or melting. So with that said, they have this point where they can, let's say, have the clock speed of the GPU running at, I'm just pulling a figure out my ass, 900 megahertz. Well, if they were then to go all the way up to 970, it's possible that that may push them over the envelope of power draw that they can actually dissipate the heat produced, the TDP. So they might say, well, we can't get away with that, so what we're going to have to do is go with 940 megahertz, which will obviously produce a little more GPU performance. Regarding the memory, that's a bit of a tricky one. It really comes down to how far along the SoC is and how much time it requires for the bringing up process. To be honest, I have absolutely no idea the level of complexity of it. I do know that the PS4 is using a 256-bit memory bus and Polaris is using a 256-bit memory bus. So for them to, let's say, put in a 320-bit memory bus or 384-bit, presumably one would mean they'd have to redesign the memory controller and potentially some of the traces along the PCB of the motherboard. But with that said, it really depends on, well, how long that takes, and honestly I have absolutely no idea if they'd want to go through it. The other potential is they could always just say, fuck it, we're just going to put in 16 gigabytes of memory. Now, they would still have to do a few changes, like they'd have to make sure that they can source large enough capacity DIMMs. They can, because I believe it's Micron that are producing it. I'm not going to Google it, but I believe it's Micron issued a statement that they're producing large enough DIMMs, and a couple of other companies are pretty much hot on their heels. So it really comes down to, could they get them at a cheap enough price, at a large enough quantity, at high enough clock speeds? Well, the answer is yes. As for clock speeds of the memory, well, the PS4 is running at 5500 megahertz, and I refer to the clock speed here of the memory. That's effective. You've got GDDR5 memory now that's running 8 gigahertz, so they could easily squeeze in additional memory bandwidth if they so desired. So really, yeah, they could indeed tweak the performance of the GPU slash memory bandwidth slash whatever else they need to do if they wanted to. The key words are if they wanted to, if they've got enough time, if the vendors who are providing them the components can do it in a decent, cheap enough quantity. Because it all comes down to things such as yields as well. For example, if they know that, obviously pulling figures out my ass because I have no idea what the production levels are in terms of yields for AMD and their various manufacturers, but let's, for the sake of this video, say that to get the 911 megahertz and all of the other clock speeds that they need for the SoC, the APU, 1 in 50 fail. So you could basically say 2 in every 100 fail to reach those speeds, which means they're basically useless for the PS4K. Well, let's say that they needed the GPU once ago to go to this 970 megahertz. It could be, in that instance, it becomes 2 in every 50 or 3 in every 50 are useless. Now, obviously, I'm pulling figures out my ass, but if that's the case, that starts to eat into their profit margins quite considerably, because AMD are not necessarily going to have to eat the costs. It really is going to be down to Sony. So that, at the end of the day, gets passed down to us as customers, which means it could be that an additional 10 or 20 or 30 pounds, depending on what the yields are, would end up needing to be thrown onto the onto the cost of the console. And finally, on the same subject of that, it also comes down to some level left in the tank. For example, if you were to go to Google, after this video is finished of course, and you were to type in PlayStation 1 overclocking, there are people who have overclocked the PlayStation 1 by a considerable margin. They've done the same for the Mega Drive, which I believe Genesis/Mega Drive ran around 7.5 megahertz. There are folks who've got it to like 10 or 12 megahertz, and you can certainly do that. Some people even went as far as to apply heat sinks onto the chips. And you can do that by all means, because the chip is actually rated to be much higher than what is found inside the system. But the problem is, doing that, you are actually increasing the chance of failure. So for example, you could have the situation where 2 years down the line, the system's going to be a lot less reliable than if they had put the thing running at the original clock speed. And that also means that Sony would potentially in the future have to deal with a lot more returns/warranties, which also could mean that you as customers would need to buy a new system if it ran out of warranty. And the last thing, and I know I'm kind of going off on one here, but the other tangent is that, let's say Sony did improve the clock speeds of the GPU to a ginormous quantity. Let's say they even got to like 1.05 gigahertz. I don't know why I said 1.05, because I said 1050 megahertz. I'd probably even know it simpler. But let's say they did that. Or let's say they pushed it all the way to like 5.4 T-flops. So the PS4K was only 600 G-flops behind the system. So it was about 10% slower, which is pretty marginal at best. Well, the problem is, Microsoft haven't released their system yet. So if Sony aim to release the PS4K this year, let's say they put it out in November, let's say late November, Microsoft have got an entire year to then say, thanks, we're just going to increase the clock speed of our system more. Done. They'll just increase it another 25 or 50 megahertz, and because they've got more compute units, the scales tip a lot faster. So, for example, if you have 18 compute units of the PS4 and you increase the clock speed to 900 megahertz, you're going to get a lot you're going to get a lot more out of that than if you were to do the same to the Xbox, the original Xbox, which only has 12 compute units active. So those are the problems. But anyway, I've gone on a massive tangent which didn't really have anything to do with the initial piece of news, but hey, it was a thing, and I'm not going to get much chance to do anything else today, so it's something from me to you, don't you know. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video, or maybe not, depending on the level of rambling you can tolerate. It's really hot in this room without the fans on. It's pretty damn hot. Yeah, pretty much. Anyway, take care of yourselves. Bye for now.